There is a stretch of State Street in Racine, Wisconsin, where the sidewalk still runs past a wall of dark brick that has not made a tractor since the last century. Weeds have taken the loading dock. A chain-link fence keeps the curious out of a parking lot big enough, once, to hold the day shift's cars 3 rows deep. If you stand there in October, when the light goes long and orange across Lake Michigan a few blocks east, you can still make out the ghost of a painted sign on the brick. Faded, but legible if you know what you're looking for. Case. The company that put that name on more American barns, silos, and fence posts than almost any other implement maker in history does not build so much as a single machine in this city anymore. It hasn't in decades. The building is still here. The name, in a sense, is still here. But the company that Jerome Increase Case built is not. And the reason it isn't has less to do with tractors than with an oil and gas conglomerate out of Houston, Texas that never grew corn or ran a combine in its life.
This is the story of how that happened. In 1842, a 23-year-old named Jerome Increase Case arrived in Racine County, Wisconsin, with 6 groundhog threshing machines he'd built back east, and a plan to sell them to wheat farmers along the shore of Lake Michigan. He sold 5 before he'd even finished the trip, kept the 6th to improve on it, and within a year had set up shop in Rochester, Wisconsin, refining the design into something sturdier and faster at separating grain from straw. By 1844, he'd moved the operation to Racine itself, where water power and lake shipping made scaling up possible, and the J.I. Case Threshing Machine Company, formally incorporated under that name decades later in 1880, was underway. Case built his first steam traction engine in the 1870s, putting Racine at the center of the shift from horsepower to mechanical power on the American farm. By the time Case died in 1891, his company was already one of the largest agricultural equipment makers in the country, and Racine, a mid-sized lake town most people outside Wisconsin had never heard of, had become, in the minds of 2 generations of Midwestern farmers, simply where Case comes from.
Every one of the great agricultural brands had a color, and for the farmers who ran them, the color was never just paint. Alice Chalmers was Persian orange. Oliver was meadow green. Minneapolis Moline ran prairie gold. International Harvester farmers knew Farmall red. Case's color, adopted for its tractor line beginning in the early 1930s, was Flambeau red, named for the Flambeau River in northern Wisconsin, a deep, almost brick-toned red that in later decades would be paired with a cream or gray grill. A Case red tractor coming up the section road told a neighbor something specific about the farm it belonged to, that here was an operation that had likely bought Case since the threshing machine days, that trusted the company's crawlers and combines as much as its tractors, that had probably weathered more than one hard decade with a Case machine still running in the machine shed. Flambeau red on the horizon was a kind of handshake between families who might never have met.
If there is one tractor that represents Case at its peak, most collectors and old-timers alike will point to the Case 1030, built between 1965 and 1969, though the broader Case 30 series and, a decade later, the Case 1370 and 1470 Spirit of 76 articulated four-wheel drives tend to come up in the same breath. The 1030 carried a 6-cylinder diesel, putting out roughly 100 horsepower at the belt, genuinely big for a mid-1960s row crop tractor, wrapped in the Power Streak styling that gave Case tractors of the era their long, sculpted hood and full-width grille. New, a 1030 in 1966 ran a farmer somewhere in the neighborhood of $8,000 to $9,000, depending on options. A well-restored example today can bring $12,000 to $18,000 at a collector auction, occasionally more if the original paperwork and dealer tag survive with it. One Wisconsin farmer, recalling the machine years later in an oral history collected by a regional agricultural heritage society, described climbing onto a 1030 for the first time as like moving up from a horse to a car, a machine that could pull a bigger plow through wet spring ground without laboring, that started reliably in a Wisconsin January, and that a man could run from 6 in the morning until the light gave out, without feeling like it was fighting him the whole way. That's the tractor a farmer in Iowa, Illinois, or Wisconsin in 1968 would have known Case by, not as a corporate name on a balance sheet, but as the machine sitting in his own machine shed, or his neighbor's.
Case remained independent.
through booms, through the Depression, through 2 world wars, until the 1960s, when it became a takeover target almost by accident. Case had been acquired by American type founders in the 1950s. Then, in 1964, it fell under the control of Kern County Land Company, a California land and agriculture holding company. Kern County Land itself became the target of a hostile pursuit in 1967 by Tenneco, Inc., at that point a Houston-based pipeline and energy conglomerate that had been buying up unrelated businesses at a startling rate since the early 1960s, everything from chemicals to shipbuilding to insurance. Tenneco won Kern County Land in 1967, and with it inherited Case as a subsidiary almost as an afterthought, a Wisconsin farm equipment maker swallowed whole by a Texas pipeline company that had never intended at the outset to be in the tractor business at all. Over the next several years, Tenneco consolidated its position, and by the early 1970s it held a controlling stake, eventually well over half the company's stock, and Case's board answered ultimately to Houston.
For a while, this arrangement mostly worked. Tenneco left Case's Racine management largely in charge of day-to-day operations through the 1970s, and Case, riding a historic boom in farm exports and land values, had some of the best years in its history, expanding its construction equipment line, investing in new combine and four-wheel drive tractor plants, and by the end of the decade, standing as one of the 2 or 3 largest full-line farm equipment makers in North America. Case employed at its peak in the late 1970s tens of thousands of workers across a network of Wisconsin, Ohio, and international plants. Racine's identity and Case's identity were, for 100 years, close to the same thing. Then came the 1980s. Between 1981 and 1986, more than 300,000 American farms went through foreclosure or forced liquidation. Land values that had climbed through the inflationary 1970s, when farmers had been encouraged by their own lenders, and often by the machinery companies themselves, to borrow against rising land prices to expand, collapsed by as much as 60% in parts of the Corn Belt. Interest rates, which the Federal Reserve pushed toward 21% at the start of the decade to break inflation, turned that same borrowed expansion into a debt trap. Commodity prices for corn, wheat, and soybeans fell at the same time export markets shrank, squeezed by a grain embargo against the Soviet Union and a strengthening dollar that made American grain more expensive abroad. For a farmer, it meant land worth less than the loan against it, income that no longer covered the interest, and, for hundreds of thousands of families, the sheriff's sale. For an equipment maker, it meant something just as brutal, an order book that could empty out in a single season, because a farmer facing foreclosure does not buy a new tractor. Case's own sales, along with those of every one of its competitors, fell off a cliff in the first half of the 1980s. Dealers who had carried inventory built for a boom now sat on lots full of unsold four-wheel drives. And it was into this collapse, not before it, not after it, but directly into the worst years of it, that Tenneco made its next move. International Harvester, the maker of Farmall red tractors, and one of the oldest and largest names in American agricultural machinery, was by 1984 in a crisis of its own, bleeding cash after a brutal, prolonged labor strike earlier in the decade, and unable to survive as a standalone farm equipment company. In 1984, Tenneco's Case division agreed to acquire the agricultural equipment assets, much of the dealer network, and a share of the manufacturing footprint of International Harvester's farm machinery business, while Harvester itself retreated to its truck operations and was renamed Navistar. The combined agricultural operation was rebranded Case International in 1985, later shortened simply to Case IH, and the deal made the new company, on paper, one of the 2 largest full-line farm equipment manufacturers in the world, standing toe-to-toe with John Deere. But a merger struck at the bottom of the worst farm recession in 50 years is not a merger struck from strength. It is often a merger struck out of necessity on both sides, and the years right after it showed the strain. Case shut down a significant share of its own production capacity, as the 2 companies' overlapping factories, dealer territories, and product lines were consolidated and cut down.
Case reported a $1 million loss in 1986, even as the broader farm recession continued to deepen, a far cry from the profits of a decade before. And by 1987, Tenneco's own management was expressing open frustration with Case's financial performance and production delays. The Farmall red paint disappeared from dealer lots first, folded into Case's Flambeau red livery. And then the two-name badge, Case IH, began replacing decades of brand loyalty on both sides with something new, corporate, and to a lot of longtime customers, unfamiliar.
Tenneco, through all of this, was never really an agricultural company in its own mind. It was a conglomerate that happened to own one, alongside a shipyard, a packaging business, a chemicals arm, and, for a time, insurance companies. Case's fortunes rose and fell inside Tenneco's much larger balance sheet as one division among many. And when Tenneco itself hit financial trouble at the start of the 1990s, posting a loss of more than $700 million in 1991 amid a broader restructuring under new chief executive Michael Walsh, Case's fate was decided in Houston boardrooms, not Racine ones. Walsh's restructuring plan called for shedding non-core assets, cutting more than 10,000 jobs across the Tenneco empire, and ultimately getting Case off Tenneco's books entirely. On April 26, 1994, Tenneco filed to spin Case off through a public stock offering. On June 24, 1994, the newly formed Case Equipment Corporation listed on the New York Stock Exchange, selling roughly 29% of its shares to the public, before renaming itself simply Case Corporation on July 1st. Over the following 2 years, Tenneco sold down the rest of its stake, and by the mid-1990s, Case stood alone again for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Independent, but a changed company, one built around the Case IH badge rather than the Flambeau red nameplate its founder would have recognized. Independence did not last as its own chapter for very long either. In 1999, Case merged with Fiat's New Holland agricultural equipment operations to form CNH Global, and the Case name, while it survives today on both the agricultural and construction sides of that business, has not stood alone as an independent American farm equipment maker since. The plant on State Street in Racine that once employed thousands building tractors, combines, and threshers is largely gone as a manufacturing site. Racine's broader industrial base, of which Case was the anchor for a century and a half, has shrunk considerably since the 1970s, and the city's population has fallen from a peak of roughly 95,000 in 1970 to somewhere in the low 70,000s in recent decades. CNH Industrial, the successor company, still maintains operations and a presence tied to the Case name in Wisconsin and Racine County, but the sprawling downtown manufacturing complex that once defined the city's skyline and its employment base is a fraction of what it was. Walk certain blocks near the old plant today, and you'll find some buildings repurposed, some standing empty, and a civic memory in the Case family homes still standing along the lakefront, in the County Historical Society's collection, in the name still stamped on old parts bins at farm sales that outlasts the factory floor that built it. What survives, in the fullest sense, isn't the corporate entity, it's the machines and the people who won't let them go quiet. Case and Case IH collector clubs meet across the Midwest every summer at county fairgrounds in Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Minnesota, where restored 1030s and 800 series tractors and Flambeau red crawlers from the 1950s roll out for parades and pulling competitions in front of crowds who remember exactly what that shade of red meant on their own family's farm. Parts networks, some official, most built by enthusiasts trading through swap meets and online forums, keep 60 and 70-year-old machines running with a dedication that has nothing to do with resale value and everything to do with memory. A farmer who grew up riding on his father's Case fender doesn't need a factory to still exist for that tractor to mean something. He needs the machine itself, and enough people who understand why it matters to keep it turning over one more spring. There's a particular kind of loss in an agricultural brand disappearing that a car brand vanishing doesn't quite carry, because a tractor was never just transportation. It was the machine a family's whole livelihood ran through,
the thing standing between a planted field and a harvested one, the partner that showed up in the dark before dawn and worked until the light was gone, same as the man or woman running it. When Jerome Increase Case sold those first threshing machines out of a wagon in Rochester, Wisconsin in 1842, he was selling farmers a way to get more of the harvest in before the weather turned. 150 years later, the company that grew out of that wagon had become a subsidiary line item on the books of a Houston pipeline conglomerate, sold and merged and restructured according to a logic that had nothing to do with what happens in a field in October. The tractors themselves, the Flambeau Reds still parked in barns outside